Good evening. My name is Wai-Ping Sun. I serve as the chair of Board of Directors of Asia Society Texas Center. I'd like to give a Texas-sized welcome to the members of Asia Society joining us this evening from around the world. We are honored to host renowned journalist Fareed Zakaria as our guest speaker for tonight's program. Fareed is an international recognized figure and the host of Fareed GPS for CNN worldwide. Since its debut in 2008, the program has become a prominent television forum for global newsmakers and thought leaders. Fareed is the recipient of the Arthur Ross Media Award by the American Academy of Diplomacy and has been awarded the Padma Bhushan by the Indian government, which is one of its highest civilian honors. Fareed has also been named as the top 10 global thinker of the last 10 years by Foreign Policy magazine. And Esquire has called him the most influential foreign policy advisor of his generation. Tonight's program will focus on Fareed's new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. COVID-19 has disrupted life around the world, closing borders between nations, shutting down businesses and schools, and altering work and social routines. Yet amid all this, Fareed sees transformational possibilities and the political, social, technological, and economic consequences that may take years to unfold. Framed in the form of 10 lessons, Fareed reflects on the past, present, and the future of the life in the 21st century, and how our choices today will affect the future. Moderating the program is Mustafa Tamiz, CEO of Outreach Strategists, a digital media and public affairs firm. Mustafa is an advertising expert and a national strategist, and often appears as a commentator on media networks such as CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. Mustafa also serves on the board of Asia Society Texas Center. Our utmost gratitude to Shasma and Asham Martin for supporting this program. At the end of the program, we will be taking questions from the viewers. Please share your questions in the YouTube comment box. Before we get started, I would like to share that Asia Society Texas Center is an educational institution promoting cross-cultural understanding for a more inclusive world. Many of Asia Society's programs, like this one tonight, are free. Please consider supporting our work through a tax-deductible gift by texting Asia Society TX to 243-725, 243-725. We hope you enjoy the program.
Fareed, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight.
It's my pleasure, and thank you. Thank you to the Asia Society, and thank you, Ping, for that very generous introduction.
When I was preparing for this program, I was thinking I was going to have to do an introduction for you. And I was like, okay, where do we begin, right? Because you begin to read the different elements. And one thing that I what struck me was that we live in a very complex world. Information is coming to us and at a rapid clip, and it's right on our fingertips. We see it all the time. What is not available is, how do you connect these dots? What does it mean? How does it relate to our lives? How does it relate to our family? And your books, and this one especially, but the prior two books, your column every week, the TV program, helps many of us just connect those dots. And so, people call you a public intellectual, but I think it's also public service, because nowadays the anxieties that get risen by world events, if we don't understand them, it becomes very difficult for people to navigate their life and their business. And so, a big thank you for not just being here, but your public service that you provide every week on your show.
Well, Mustafa, you're very kind to say that, but you also have you've intuited exactly what it is that I'm trying to do. So for one thing, I sometimes think to myself that what I am trying to do is to find the signal amidst the noise, because the noise has gotten so overwhelming. If you think back to the world that I grew up in, the Cold War, few media outlets, few prestigious universities, there was very little noise. There was a fairly strong signal. You knew, you may not like it, you may disagree with, but you could tell what was going on. Today, if you just think about the amount of production of information, of news, the generation of noise is so great that you have this huge problem. I often tell my kids, my education was about, the search for finding information, which was very difficult and valuable, right? I grew up in India, not easy to get the best information, the best. So how do you get a subscription to The Economist? How did you find Today, the problem for a young person in education is the opposite. It is how to sift through the avalanche of information being and entertainment and noise. And how do you find what's really important, right? How do you figure out what the signal is? So that's what I'm trying to do. And look, Jefferson said that journalism is public education, that this was part of the mandate of the free press. It's why it's the only industry in the world that is protected by law. The United States Constitution there's only one industry that is protected in the Constitution, in the First Amendment, right? So we have an obligation to actually engage in something that is not just generating heat, but also generating light.
I have similar conversations with my kids. I tell them they're the smartest generation because it's compound knowledge is what they have. If they have a question, they ask it and they learn more and learn more. When I was growing up, kind of like you went to the Encyclopedia Britannica. At best, you had a paragraph. Right?
Exactly.
And so with it, I hope that the big challenges that we face are solved by this generation, because there is just a lot of knowledge that people can access at their fingertip. They just need to know what it means and how to act upon it. And so as we talk about this, I want to talk a little bit about the process of writing this book. There's subjects where you study, you read, you were living through this like the rest of us, right? I mean, your life had to change just like all of our lives changed. It's one of those things that this pandemic has affected everybody, rich, poor, young, old. So as you were tell us about the process of writing this book. When did you get started, and how did you come up with it?
Sure. It's really actually, to me, was sort of interesting. It happened more intuitively and organically than any other book I've written. So the middle of March, the shutdowns begin. We realize we're in a situation where we have to. And I'm with my family. As it turned out, it was the beginning of spring break for my kids, for two of my kids. So it was serendipitous where we happened to be together anyway. So we hunker down, and I'm starting to think to myself, what does all this mean for the show, for my column, just to help me understand the world? I realized that, one of the ways I deal with crises is I'm a nerd. And so I want to read more about it. I ask experts, I look into the history, When has this happened before? What are the patterns? And I started jotting down some thoughts. And I realized that I was jotting down kind of, trends. What are the big trends coming out of this? And I called up my publisher and I said, I know I owe you a book. I have owed him a book for something else. And I said, but I think there's a book here because it's exactly the point you were making. This is the most global event that I've ever lived through in my lifetime. My suspicion is that any of us have ever lived through. Just to give you a sense of comparison, 9/11, for somebody living in Japan, in South Korea, in Brazil, had no impact, right? I mean, yeah, they got a few more X-ray machines in the airports, but it was not something centrally involving them. This crisis, every person on the planet has been affected in some sense, in some way. And so I recognized that there was something here that needed working through, that needed thinking through. And what I would do then, once I figured out I was going to try and write a book, I jotted down what I thought of as the lessons, the trends. And interestingly, I spent 4.5 months writing it. Those didn't change. A lot else changed, a lot of my thinking, but I would get up at 6 a.m. I would sit down to work at about 6:30, and I wouldn't look at any newspaper, any news source, because I wanted to keep myself focused on what's going on beyond, what's going on beyond the horizon, what is the shape of things to come. And I do find that in today's world, you have to discipline yourself not to get overwhelmed with the day-to-day, with the trip. You've got to discipline yourself so that the urgent doesn't take over from the important. The urgent is not, it's not unimportant, or it's real, it's urgent, but it can overwhelm the important and you lose sight of what the big trend is. And so I would just spend from 6 to about 10:30, 6:30 to 10:30. I would just sit and read, write, and research. And I did that for 4.5 months, every day, Sundays, Saturdays, and Sundays included. I figured I was seeing my kids enough, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that I didn't have to worry about like the normal things we worry about, which is, am I spending enough time with my family on the weekends? I was spending enough time with my family. So I did that, and it was really cathartic because it helped me make sense of what was going on. And in a way, I hope that it's helped other people as well.
I thought it was great. Let me. Most books end with a sense of like optimism for the future. The minority of the books end with a sense of despair, but yours does neither. Instead, you say that we might, take the opportunities or squander it. I want to push you a little bit when it comes to America. I mean, you predicted the pandemic, right? In a way, there's a lot of stuff out there, but you actually put it out in a concise way. So as you look ahead, where does America land post-pandemic?
I am an immigrant like you, Mustafa, and I think I'm therefore almost in my DNA, I've become an optimist about America. It's like we made a choice to come here and find a new world and a new life. But I think it's grounded in some real facts and a sense of where we're going. The United States remains the most dynamic country in the world. It remains the most productive, energetic. If you think about all the technologies of the future, the United States still continues to dominate them. We have to get some of the other parts of society right. We have to get government right. We have to understand what government can do, how it can do it well, both domestically and internationally. And so that's one of the reasons I end the book the way I do, which is we have the capacity to come out of this very strong. If I had to choose the cards that any country has, and I look at the United States and I look at China and I look at the Europeans, I would take America's hand. But it's a very tough new world out there with a lot of big challenges that are global, with a lot of new competitors. So we've got to get this right, and we have to step up to it. But I think, you'd be surprised at how much America can get done if you do the right things. The column I just wrote today, was about the vaccine and the vaccine development rollout. And to me, what's fascinating about it is the Biden administration just decided they believed in government. They were going to make this work. They were going to put everything they had into it, and they owned it, right? Biden came in and said, this is my responsibility. This is the federal government's responsibility, and we will vaccinate the country, but we're going to set a target for 1 million a day. I wrote the column that week saying 1 million is too small. He's got to double that. Yesterday, the United States vaccinated 2.2 million people. We are now on a 7-day rolling average doing 2 million vaccinations a day. We have vaccinated 15% of the country. That is 5 times as much per capita as China. That is 3 times as much per capita as Europe. We will get to, I predict, 3 million vaccinations a day. And we will have the entire country, the people who are willing to do it, vaccinated by May. Now, that's, that all that took was, and by the way, I want to give Biden a lot of credit. I believe if President Mitt Romney had been in the White House, the same thing would have happened, which is to say, you need people who actually believe in government, who understand that administering a vast bureaucracy is complicated. It's not reality television. It's not tweeting. It's actually making stuff happen. And we can do it. It's the same government that put a man on the moon. It's the same government that created the internet. So I do believe that we have that capacity, but we've got to get serious about it.
Well, let me just take that point about government expanded this way. In your book, you made a really interesting observation about democracies and dictatorship and how they handle COVID-19. I think there are times that we see people, just oversimplifying their analysis. But I think you have a very interesting take about this, and I think it's an important one because, many people are stepping back, and just kind of like the lights just went out in my room, right? And I'm in Texas, so it makes you nervous every time the lights go out. but there was an interesting kind of analysis that you had that had a different balance, and rather than democracies are good during pandemic or dictatorships are good, I think you had a nuanced approach. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So if you look at the data, what's interesting is the countries that did best in the pandemic are not, as you say, all democracies or all dictatorships. What they tend to have is a really strong focus on the quality of government rather than the quantity or the nature of government, right? So the countries that do well are Taiwan. I realize it's not a country, but for purposes of analysis, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, again, if you think of it as a separate country, Vietnam, which is interesting because it's a poor country. And what they all had in common is a very strong dedication to creating effective, lean, independent bureaucracies staffed by technocrats. Also, most of them, very strong tradition of non-corrupt government, which is an important part, partly for efficiency, but crucially for social trust. When a bureaucrat tells you in Singapore, here are the 3 things you should do to keep yourself safe and to keep the country safe, you believe that person. When a bureaucrat unfortunately tells you that in India or Nigeria, you don't have the same experience. You think these guys are in it for themselves. There's some, the scam, there's corruption, right? So these places had a strong emphasis on the quality of government. Now, I would add to that one more thing, Mustafa, which is it's also important. It's not just about the government. It's about the people as well. So in Europe, you saw that some of the places that did pretty well at the start, Denmark, Germany, you could look at New Zealand, you could look at a few other Northern European countries, Iceland, smaller ones, Finland. They have done pretty well, but you began to see them losing that capacity because the people got tired and they said, we're not going to listen to the government. We've done it. We're enough of this, right? In France, you saw this. Come August, the French decided that it was their constitutional God-given right to go to the beach. And they all went to the south of France and partied. And guess what? You saw a huge spike. The countries of East Asia that I was mentioning, on the other hand, there was still a strong sense of collective endeavor. This was a collective effort. In a sense, the mask is a very good symbol of this, and whether you can wear a mask is a good symbol of this social contract, because the mask doesn't really protect you; it protects the other people.
Yeah.
So what you're saying when you wear the mask is, I will protect you, you will protect me, and together we will keep our community safe. And it turns out that kind of sense of collective responsibility is stronger in East Asia than it is in Europe. So there's government, there's society. To get the perfect score, you needed both to be working.
Yeah, there's a kind of an old sentiment that government is just our collective agreement, and
Absolutely.
It's only as strong and as efficient and effective as our collective agreement. You also mentioned Taiwan, and there was something interesting, that I've been thinking about, that, Taiwan was able to successfully use technology to manage the pandemic. You noted that much kind of like about technology in your book, like smartphones and location tracking. These technologies were invented in the United States. Why were we not able to take advantage of them versus countries like Taiwan did?
It's even more amazing than that, Mustafa, because Taiwan, the response was run by the guy who's the vice president of Taiwan. He's no longer the vice president, the former vice president, who is a Johns Hopkins trained epidemiologist. So we're teaching them the secret sauce, and then they're going and applying it there, but we can't do it here. Look, he said to me, he was probably the smartest guy I talked to about all this. He said, the key thing to understand is the number of people who get COVID or potentially are in danger of getting COVID is very small. You just have to make sure you keep them isolated from the general population. The key is therefore not testing, not tracing. It is the isolation of the sick and the potentially sick. In Taiwan, he pointed out that the sum total of all those people was 1% of the population, 220,000 people out of 21 million, right? But what they did was they were able to keep those people isolated. It was a mandatory 14-day quarantine. But by doing that, Taiwan was able to handle the entire COVID crisis without a single day lockdown. See, that was the key. He said, if you act early, aggressively, and most importantly, intelligently, then you're using the scalpel of isolation rather than the sledgehammer of the lockdown. What he said to me is, if you're doing a lockdown, it means you've already failed. It means you have lost the ability to control those small number of people who have the disease or may have it. Now, why was that possible? You're right, they used technology well. By the way, very simply, they gave you a government-issued cell phone, and they said to you, we'll call you 3 times a day. If you don't pick up the phone, that is prima facie a violation of the quarantine. So you can't leave the phone in the hotel room and go to do grocery shopping. Whatever you do, you have to have the phone with you. And they kept tabs on you. It's a democracy. There was no brute police power or anything like that. So it's not so much the technology, it was their willingness to be very intelligent and to really push people. Now, people say to me, well, you couldn't do that with civil liberties in America. Well, what I don't understand is we were willing to accept weeks and weeks of lockdowns where you're shutting people's businesses down, where you're not allowing them to engage in any economic transaction. And we're okay with that. But you're not okay with putting somebody in a hotel for 14 days because he's got COVID and saying, just keep out of the, don't infect anyone else. I mean, the economic cost here, it's not even, it's impossible to even explain to me. You could have kept every person in America who had COVID or potentially had COVID in a 4 Seasons. And you would not, think about the amount of money. We've spent $4 trillion already in COVID relief. We'll spend another 2 to 3 trillion by the time we're done. I think we could have afforded the 4 Seasons.
I would have taken Ritz too. I would even set it higher. As there's issues of privacy that are coming up when you talk about contact tracing. When you mentioned that, people went to the beaches, right? And we could see that. that was location tracking, right? We were actually seeing maps of people going places and coming back. So technology was used all the time. It seems like privacy arguments are made when they are convenient. And I think it goes back to our sense of collective good. Like you're able to see, do you value our privacy right now, or do we need to, take a little bit of your privacy away for the collective good? And that balance is very difficult, I see in the United States and Europe.
Well, and I think that, there's a tendency to forget you're giving up your privacy to Google and Facebook and Snapchat every day. And you're giving up your privacy so that those companies can give you free search or can better target their ads toward you. Surely in the midst of a once in a century global pandemic, you can give up the same amount of privacy that you're giving Google so that they can show you the right sneakers that you're thinking of buying. So I think there's somehow we lose track of the proportions here. And as I say again, we gave up our civil liberties by being shut down for weeks and weeks, and yet we would, it would get our backs up if somebody were to say, well, you've got a quarantine. The truth about public health is it is inescapably a public endeavor, right? This is one of the reasons why we still have, with all the good stuff that's happened in the last while, 4% of the world's population. We have 25% of the world's COVID deaths. We have the worst COVID deaths than anywhere else because we actually never had a lockdown. You can't have a lockdown when you have 50 states and 2,000 different local authorities that each make their own plans, right? It is inherently a collective enterprise because you're not safe if other people are not safe. We're going to discover this even as this rolls out. At the end of the day, if we leave pockets of a disease going, we're just, it's a big, vast, open, free country, and it's never going to die.
Let me switch gears a little bit. Many have started to view the world through a bipolar political lens. The great powers like the United States and China kind of is the focal point. They point out that China's got the second largest military, but it's not just the second largest, but in your book, you talk about that the next four nations combined after China, that's how big it is. You talk more about multilateralism, and I want you to take a minute. We're talking to the Asia Society's global membership here. How do you see that, and how do you see it unfolding in the world in the next decade?
It's funny, when the pandemic hit, I was struck by the fact that this was a classic global event. And it was a kind of global threat that hit everybody. And it hit everyone, whether you were rich or poor, black or brown, east or west, but rather than bringing us together, it drove us apart. United States started to make accusations towards China. Even in Europe, you saw they imposed border controls. The Italians started blaming the Germans started blaming the Italians. But in fact, it is clearly the case that we can't get out of this unless we have more global cooperation. You can't isolate yourself. And the best example of this, I think, is, we then started to worry about global supply chains. And oh my God, we can't get masks for a few weeks because there was a run on masks. So it's all because of China, because we can't, we started to blame the lack of supply on masks on the fact that we were all dependent on China. Well, now what we are celebrating right now is the extraordinary arrival of the vaccines, which is truly a miracle. If you had asked somebody 10 years ago, how long would it take to make a vaccine for a new disease? Most people would have said 15 years. That would have been a reasonable estimate. And we have in 9 months produced basically 5 vaccines. We'll probably be on the way to 7 to 10. And we will produce 4 billion to 5 billion vaccines within 2 years. Why is that? Entirely because of globalization, global cooperation, and multilateralism. The virus is the genome is sequenced in China in January. German scientists start working on it immediately. American pharma companies pick up the research endeavor. It starts to get funded by governments all over the world. And most importantly, the production becomes this massive global enterprise, totally cross-border, everyone using whatever they, had, people had comparative advantage of. I think about 60% of the vaccine is being made in India. The glass vials are all coming out of China. The swabs are coming out of somewhere else. You have a classic example of the benefits of global cooperation and globalization. Well, this is what we tend to do. We pocket the benefits, and then when you have a 2-day delay on getting a mask, you blame the Chinese, or you blame some other country. So what we have got to do is realize we're in this global world. We have no alternative. The question is, can we find a way to make it work? Some of that does mean mitigating some of the dangers, some of the damage. Maybe we need to have strategic medical supplies of some PPE that in a crisis you would want to have fast before the capitalism works fantastically at this. We were able to produce these masks amazingly fast. Within 1 month after the pandemic, you had an oversupply of masks, and the price of masks in China, by the way, went down 90% because your supply had so exceeded demand, right? So, but there are these periods where you don't have it, so maybe you need to stockpile some things. But the more important point is we're in this together. We have to make this work together. We're not going to be able to make it work by warring on each other. We've tried that. 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. Didn't work so well. What we have created is this extraordinary open global system, rule-based, open global economy, low tariffs, that has produced more wealth for the world, more prosperity, more stability than any period prior to that in human history. So my hope is that what we have that historical perspective and realize, we have gained an enormous amount by helping to create the world we have since 1945. We, the United States, and we have a huge interest in maintaining that. Obviously, dealing with some of the issues that it raises, some of the inequalities it raises, some of the fact that not everybody benefited as much as others did. But that's not a reason to junk the whole project and go back to some kind of, a world of narrow nationalism, rivalry, protectionism, and war. That will not solve the problem.
I want to stay on this a little bit. And I want to go back to what we started talking about earlier, which is a government is just a collective agreement, right? So you hit on trade a little bit, you hit on security a little bit in terms of how the world cooperates with each other. How do we bring the larger part of the public and I want to say convince them of this argument, but how do we build consensus around it? Because we're seeing populism across the world, in the United States as well as across the world. So how do we get the public, the larger populace, on board with this idea?
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge because partly, people pocket the gains and they focus on the losses. So, every American has gotten a huge tax cut over the last 25 years because of globalization and the information revolution. All those cheap goods that you buy in Walmart, all those cheap clothes that you buy at Costco and Walmart, that's because of globalization. All the cheap food that you get, and as the data on this is very clear. The price of food and clothing, basic clothing, has gone down dramatically. Is because of globalization, and those things benefit poor people much more than rich people. You may be buying, fancy custom-made suits that are handmade and very expensive, but the guy buying the stuff off the rack from Costco or Walmart, or the woman, they're getting a huge tax cut. They're getting a huge reduction in prices, and that is meaningful because those are significant parts of their weekly expenditures. So there is a huge benefit that we have had, but the benefit is spread around the entire population. The cost is narrow and specific. You see the steel plant in one town that goes out of business, and politics tends to respond to those kind of arresting, narrow visual images, right? And that becomes the way you handle it. The second piece of this is it's much easier to sell fear than it is to sell hope. If you look at why did Donald Trump win? Forget the election of 2016, which is a bit of a fluke. I just mean by that, it was a statistical tie. You know, it was 70,000 votes had gone the other way. Hillary Clinton would have narrowly won. But the primary was a fascinating window into what was resonating. And the other 16 Republican candidates essentially made an argument that was a variation on the Reagan formula. Low taxes, limited government, strong America, spread democracy abroad. And it fell flat. Trump said, I'll tell you what's really going on in the world today. The Chinese are taking your factories. The Mexicans are taking your jobs. The Muslims are trying to kill you. I'll beat them all up. You'll be great again. That message resonated because, you know, when you see a complicated world and you're anxious, if somebody tells you it's all that guy's fault and that guy looks different and he sounds different and he worships a different God, it's a very compelling message. And so what we have to figure out a way to inspire people, to make them understand that, you know, it's not about blaming somebody. It's not about finding somebody you can scapegoat. Because, by the way, it doesn't work. I mean, manufacturing jobs have not come back in 4 years. The tariffs have cost American consumers enormous money. Just to get the sense of one data point on that, in the last 4 years, the United States federal government has given $60 billion in farm subsidies to America's farmers to compensate them for the loss of income because of the tariff war with China, right? So that makes you, I mean, the tariffs don't work. We've tried this in the past. But how to explain that, you know, that the answer is not just getting tough with the Chinese, bullying them, showing somebody who's boss, getting tough with the Mexicans. It all sounds great. But at the end of the day, you've got to find a win-win. You've got to find, this is something I think most businessmen understand. You've got to find win-wins. If the other guy doesn't feel like he's winning, you haven't got a deal that's going to work, that's going to endure. So maybe what we have to do is we have to find a way to inspire people about the future. We have to make them less fearful. And I think a lot of the fear is actually not economic. It's cultural. People see an America that's changing and that's got a lot of people who don't look the same. And that's, you know, it does unsettle people. I think, I wish people could understand that it's not going to change that much. The extraordinary thing about America is people assimilate so effectively. I'm guessing you have kids, Mustafa, I have kids. Mm-hmm. For an immigrant father, this debate about, you know, immigrants and will the country stay the same there has a comical dimension, I think, because as we know, the hardest thing for an immigrant parent to do is to maintain some shred of the old culture with your children. Mm-hmm. The truth is they become Americans so fast and so completely that there's very often almost nothing left. And what you're trying to do is say, just remember a little bit about where you came from and what, you know, and this was true for the Irish, this was true for the Italians, this was true for the Poles, but it's true for people who come from India or Pakistan or Nigeria, wherever it is. America does an amazing job assimilating. And so, you know, what I sometimes want to tell these people who keep thinking everyone, you know, they're going to be replaced. Trust me, you will be stunned at how similar America is going to look 30 years from now. You know, those people may look different. They're all going to be cracking the same jokes, watching the same sports, you know, having the same cultural themes and motifs, because that's the thing we do better than almost any country in the world.
Yeah, you know, you're talking about our immigrant parents. You know, I'm wearing a tie, and I know you're tie envious right now. You rather wear, but I remember my dad, you know, because my father was very particular about these things, right? If you're going to do something important, you got to dress for it. And so, you know, the more we change, the more we stay the same in America.
You know, I'll tell you about the suit since you bring it up. My brother and I are sometimes kidded by my kids, and because they notice something, we go on vacation, whatever. My brother and I, both immigrants. He's a very successful hedge fund manager. I do what I do. We shave every day. And they'll be like, you're in the middle, you're on the beach, there's nobody watching. Why are you? And there's just something about the idea that as an immigrant, you want to present the right face. For the longest time, if I was ever driving a car, I would dress appropriately because I felt like, if I ever get stopped, I don't want somebody to think that, and there's that tendency toward assimilation that I think people on the other side don't understand.
Yeah. We were talking about fears. You've had lots of conversation with Bill Gates, especially on climate change. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Climate change is going to be an enormous impact in Asia. Tens of millions of people who live below the sea level, a million more that don't have reliable access to clean water. In Texas here, we've seen the latest freeze we've had lost power because of it. Talk a little bit about how you see either the world coming together on climate change, or is the world not going to come together and we'll have more severe consequences?
Look, I think the most important thing to understand about climate change is it's already happened. So there's a significant piece of this that we just have to start getting used to, the idea that we have to engage in fairly significant adaptation already. And that means, for a place like Texas, you have to think about all the cement you have poured in various cities, which have become, kind of bathtubs in which flooding can take place and the water can sit and persist. That cannot happen. You have to think about the resilience of your power grid, because you are going to have extreme weather conditions, and you are going to have to ask yourself, is the answer that we need to be hooked up to the national grid? Is the answer that we need distributed power locally? I don't know whether that's fuel cell technology or something else, but you're going to need something, because this is not going to be a one-off, right? This, as happened 10 years ago. People predicted it would happen again. It did happen again. My guess is within the next 5 to 7 years, it's going to happen one more time. So part of it is realizing this piece of it, the adaptation. There's no debate. You have to do it. We are going to have to figure out how to do it. Then the point is, you are going to have to find some way to slow this down, because once you put the stuff up in the atmosphere, it stays there for thousands of years. That's the part where I don't think people completely understand, that once you get carbon dioxide or methane into the climate, it just sits there for literally thousands of years, and it blocks off the ability of the Earth to cool down. And so you are seeing these rising temperatures. Look, the only way we will really solve it is through global cooperation. But I think that, again, if you look at where we have gotten from today, from where we were 20 years ago, you have some reason to be encouraged. We've seen a lot of progress in certain areas and certain technologies. You've seen governments. The United States is the only country in the world where there is still a kind of debate about climate change, where there's still a political debate about whether or not it's happening. There's no other country in the world where that's happening. They're all making moves, the poorer countries less so, the richer countries more so. So I think this is a unique opportunity for the United States. But the most important thing we have to do is we have to be the world leaders. If we're going to do this, we need to show that we are serious about it. The simplest way, in my view, is to put a price on carbon. If you put a low carbon tax, which, by the way, all the oil companies now support, you first of all, you are honestly accounting for the cost of these carbon dioxide emissions into the world. You are providing yourself with the funding you need, because we need technological breakthroughs. If you look at the Texas situation, the only way Texas could have survived this without this problem is either a really smart grid connected to the rest of the country, which would have provided power, or real baseload electricity that is always on, weather resistant, no matter what. And that means, nuclear, or that means massive battery capacity, or that means, as I say, fuel cell technology. In other words, you need a technological breakthrough. So we need massive government investment in technology. The money would come from the carbon tax, in my view. And the reason I like it is very simple. I don't like overregulation. I'm a capitalist at heart. But the one thing you do know about capitalism is the government can do two things very well. It can tax and it can subsidize. And that which you tax, you will get less of. And that which you subsidize, you can get more of. So you tax stuff that emits carbon into the atmosphere, and you fund new green technologies, and you will get to it's not a miracle, you will get to the series of miracles that need to take place, which will happen. The vaccine happening in 9 months, that's a miracle. 10 years ago, people would have said that's a miracle. We need 100 miracles like that in green technology.
Yeah, and that's what I think. I think that whenever pushed to the brink, to the end of the civilization, human beings kind of rise to the occasion and come up with the solution and build a consensus. I just hope that this just doesn't keep happening when it comes to climate change, that we take some serious action. Fareed, I want to switch gears. I want to bring some of our audience that are sending questions and kind of direct them to you. There's a question from Chase. A century ago, the pandemic was followed by roaring 20s. Is the post-pandemic society likely to be serious or frivolous? And I don't think he's talking about the 20s dance. I think in a broader way, where do you think it's headed?
I think it's a very good question. I think that there's no question there's a huge pent-up demand. I'm sure all of us feel that. It'd be so nice to travel, to go to a restaurant, to go to a bar, to have that feeling of, human contact and community. So there will be some return to that kind of normalcy with a vengeance. But I think there's going to be a big difference between the 20s, and I write about this in the book, which is in the 20s, if you wanted to go back to work, you had to physically go back to an office or a farm or a factory. If you wanted to go and get entertained, you had to physically go to a theater or a Broadway show or a vaudeville act. If you wanted to even have a new meeting with somebody, make an acquaintance, you had to physically travel to that place to go there. We now have something which is unique and new, which is the digital economy, the digital world. And that didn't exist in the 1920s. So the real question that I think we're trying to all grapple with is, how much will there be a return to normalcy? How much of this digital economy that we have created or ramped up is going to persist? And my guess is the answer will be a hybrid, and it will be one we will work out slowly over with trial and error. But I suspect that's a whole bunch of routine business travel will go away, and those meetings will be conducted like this. I suspect that there will be a bunch of speeches and conferences and things like that will be like this. I think what will happen is the routine will end up in the digital world. The special stuff will be still done in person. So if you're trying to get a new deal, a new relationship, you're going to go and meet that person because you want to make a special connection. You want to make an emotional connection. If you're trying to convey something important to a group of people, if you're hoping to give them a really good time, you're going to hold a conference physically and take them to a beautiful place and have great speakers because you want that experience to be rich. But if it's a routine meeting of your team to just make sure you're all aligned on the same place, you might decide to spare everyone the going to the Holiday Inn and instead do it on Zoom. So I think we're all going to work these things out. I suspect that movies will be released in theaters, but also online, probably simultaneously, because there'll end up being two groups of people. Some people who want the communal experience and some people who want the personal convenience. I think does that lead to being frivolous or does it lead to being serious? I suspect that there will be a greater sense of sobriety that comes from all this than frivolousness, because one of the big challenges that this pandemic has exacerbated is inequality. And we're all sitting here and we're all doing well. My suspicion is most of the people on this Zoom have found a way to operate professionally in the digital space. They found a way to generate a fair amount of income in the digital space. Maybe as much, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Most of the people probably own some stocks, and those stocks have gone up, reflecting the value of this digital economy. But for anyone working in a restaurant, a hotel, a retail outfit, a cruise ship, a theme park, this is the Great Depression. And yeah, you've gotten some government support, but it doesn't change your fear about the future. It doesn't change your fear about how the economy has changed. And so I think that is going to be the central challenge economically for us. We know we can get things back. We're blessed, and it's a rich country. We can print money. The dollar is the reserve currency in the world. But what if those theater jobs don't come back? What if those cruise ships don't come back? What if what if you're seeing a permanent shift in retail or office space? There's a huge number of jobs associated with that, and that, I think, will sober us all up, as it should.
Yeah. The next question is from Yasser, and he says, at the end of the global pandemic, will there be a shift of great superpowers?
I think we are moving into a world where you are clearly seeing that there are two players above all else, the US and China. And I think you are going to see a much more competitive dynamic between them than we've seen before. And I think that competition is going to be very different from the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was fundamentally not an economic competitor to the United States. I mean, in some technological areas, it was pretty good, like the space program that the Soviets had. But by and large, it was not an economic competitor. Nobody thought Soviet cars were as good as American cars, or Soviet consumer electronics was as good as American consumer electronics. But militarily, they were a rival. They were a peer competitor. The Soviet nuclear arsenal, the Soviet conventional army. This time around, it's the flip. China is the second largest economy in the world. It is a peer competitor economically, technologically. Chinese companies are amazing, particularly the new technology ones, like Alibaba and Tencent and all of those companies that occupy the space between technology and consumerism. On the other hand, militarily, there's no contest. The United States is much, much more powerful. China has 3,000 nuclear missiles, 300 nuclear missiles. The United States has 3,000. The United States has 11 aircraft carrier groups. China has 1.5. So the real competition is going to be technology, economics, cyber. The realm is probably going to be cyber more than anything else. There's a new report just came out, the National Artificial Intelligence Commission, headed by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. And he says in this area, the China are at least equal to the United States, but probably a bit ahead. Makes sense, right? I mean, artificial intelligence is fed by data. Well, there are 4 times as many Chinese people. They use more data than we do because they've done more of a leapfrog. So if you look at average Chinese person uses, I think, 2 to 3 times as much data as an average American. And the government centrally collects all that data. So you have a circumstance where if artificial intelligence feeds on more and more data so that it can sift through, well, a country of 1.4 billion people where everybody has cell phones and uses them all the time is going to do pretty darn well when it's technologically as sophisticated as China is. So that's going to be the realm of competition. Technology. I mean, think about things like, the way we used to worry about the US-Soviet missile balance and missile gap. We're going to be worrying about semiconductors, because semiconductors are the crucial kind of blockage point in these technological competitions. And guess where the finest semiconductors in the world are all assembled? Taiwan. So you can imagine Taiwan becoming the kind of Berlin of this new bipolar world.
There's a great line in your book that I really love. It's like, the data is the new oil. And I think about that in a different context at times, because there is so much information. And we're talking about earlier, is being able to connect the dots, or the next generation of Americans, or next generation of any country, being able to connect those dots, right? Being able to strategically understand information, be able to explain it, be able to build consensus amongst each other. I think the great challenge. I see a question here from Carlos that goes to that consensus in a different way. Can you discuss the challenge of disinformation in the context of globalization?
Oh boy, that is a tough one. I think to talk about the problem of
we're not giving you easy questions here. You wrote the book. You predict the pandemic. We don't give you easy questions here. It's the Asia Society.
Look, the problem with disinformation in the context of globalization, the real issue is it's in the context of an increasingly divided societies. I would say that's the real challenge, more than globalization or the information revolution. All these things contribute. But what's happened is we are seeing these divisions, partly fueled by this inequality that we were talking about, partly fueled by the reality that there are huge divides developing along the basis of do you have college education or do you not? Do you live in a city or do you not? If you look at the 2020 election, the single best predictor of whether you voted for Trump or Biden was party loyalty, party identification. But the second strongest predictor was college education. The third strongest predictor was density of your environment. In other words, do you live in a city, in and around a city or not? So what you're seeing is these political divisions are turning into cultural divisions. And the cultural divisions are very deep and very lasting. And the reason I bring this up in the context of disinformation is you are now highly inclined to believe only a certain truths from your side and to disbelieve something put out by somebody else. Now you put into that political cultural division, you use the technologies that allow you to present things that are false as true. And people are very gullible. People are very susceptible. They want an affirmation of what they believe. And I do think that in some ways, Fox News is the great innovator here, because what Fox figured out was if they present themselves as a normal news network and present themselves as saying, we're just telling you the facts, they could get away with telling the most outrageous, outlandish, most opinionated things. And I'm not saying they're untrue, but these are highly opinionated takes on the facts, which were presented in this very calm network news, just the facts way. And that's the genius of modern disinformation, which is it is presented in the clothes of truth, objective reality, the normal instruments of information dissemination. But what you're getting actually is highly polemical, partisan, opinion disguised as fact. And the success of Fox is that it produced a mirror image then, on the other side. And I don't think that they are equivalent. I think that there's a big difference. But MSNBC was driven to the left just as, as a way of competing with Fox, and CNN finds itself somewhere awkwardly in the middle, trying to play the role that I think it should, which is to provide a greater sense of objective truth and objective reality and objective facts, but it's very hard. So how do we get out of this? I don't have a technological fix. I don't have a fix of telling the media, they should do a better job. Look, the media is a for-profit entity. If there's something on television news, the reason it's there is somebody wants to watch it. In other words, we are for-profit entities. We're not doing this as public and charity. There is a market, and that market is being fueled and is exaggerating these tendencies. So I actually think that it will take political leadership. It will take people in Washington stepping back and agreeing to work with each other, agreeing to say, look, you are our opponents, you are not our enemies, voting for each other's proposals when you agree with them. If you don't do that in Washington, I don't think the media has a magic wand that it can use to prevent disinformation.
Well, as we come close, I think that's an important point to close on, because leadership matters. And as we've seen through the pandemic, it's critical, whether it's here or around the world. And, we really see you and your role as a public intellectual is the convener of leaders. Your conversations, whether it's with Bill Gates or world leaders, not only pulls out information from them for the rest of us to understand, but I think it has an impact on them. The questions you ask drive their thinking. And so for that, we are very grateful. And we're very grateful for you being here with us today, sharing not just your book, but really of yourself. Because I read through the book, and as I was reading through it, I can sense there, I'm a Fareed Zakaria geek. I kind of watch everything, read things you do. And I could see you speak right through this book and of your experiences. So it's incredibly valuable. So let me also thank, as I thank you, I thank all of the Asia Society global members around the world, and hope they enjoyed this program. I have some announcements here. Asia Society Texas offers 150 public programs each year. They're arts, culture, education, business, policy, current events. Fareed would approve of all of these programs. Either Fareed, if you do more things with Asia Society, we will have a special event for you in Asia Society in Texas when you come post the pandemic. But
thank you.
But to support that, we would love it if you would continue to support Asia Society Texas. You can text in order to contribute and donate at 243-725. You're seeing it on your screen, hopefully. It's Asia Society Texas. Fareed, thank you so much. We appreciate your time, your generosity of your intellect to the world. And I think they're turning out the lights on me right now. So thank you all for being here. And look forward to a future program with Asia Society again.